Okay, hello everyone, let's get started. Welcome, thank you very much for being here today. My name is Emily Med and I'm the Visual Arts Programme Manager at the British Council. On behalf of British Council, ICOM UK and Museums Association, I want to welcome you to our final Meeting Place conversation. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping announcements. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website. Please submit any questions using the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screens on the menu bar. Please do not use the chat box for questions to the panel, but feel free to introduce yourselves there. We have also set up a Google document where you can connect with fellow attendees following the event. We will share this link at the end of the session. Claire Hill is providing closed captioning, which can be accessed by selecting Show Subtitles on the taskbar at the bottom of your screen. And this event is also being auto-translated in Spanish via stream text. Please click on the link in the chat to access this translating function. Additionally, Jill Wood is providing British Sign Language. So please now allow me to introduce Henry, who will introduce our panelists. Henry McGhie has a background as an ecologist, curator, and museum senior manager. He now works as a consultant and set up Curating Tomorrow in 2019 to support museums and their partners to enhance their contributions to sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals, climate action, and biodiversity conservation. He is currently working as part of the team behind Reimagining Museums for Climate Action, leading to an exhibition at Glasgow Science Centre ahead of and during COP26. So Henry, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And I'm really happy to be joined by Karin Weil González, an anthropologist and heritage officer from the Wetlands Research Centre at the Southern University of Chile. Elena Trimarchi, who's the Learning and Engagement Manager at the David Livingstone Birthplace Museum in Blantyre in Scotland. Susanne Nawrath, who's the Scientific Exhibition Manager from Klimahaus in Bremerhaven, Germany. And Julie Decker, who's the Director and CEO of the Anchorage Museum in Alaska. And I'll just say a few words of for some context. So we're here to consider how we make this shift from an unsustainable past to a sustainable future, to change direction from our current course for a better one. And a sustainable future will be one in which people and nature thrive and flourish together. And although sustainability is often thought of as minimizing harm, that's really only half true. We have to work to ensure that the present and the future are better than the past. Talk of sustainability can often be slightly vague, and sustainable development is a much more focused approach, which I personally much prefer. It's about action that helps achieve this better balance of considerations of people, planet, and prosperity. And we can think of sustainability as a kind of destination or an ever-moving horizon, and sustainable development as the action that helps us move towards that destination. The main programme for sustainable development is called Agenda 2030, agreed by the world's governments in 2015, but is also an invitation to all sectors to collaborate. It's achieved through 17 sustainable development goals to help put the world on this path to a sustainable future by 2030. The international museum sector has already committed to supporting these goals in 2019, and both ICOM and the British Council use the goals very regularly. But COVID has threatened to undermine a lot of the work that's been done to secure this sustainable future, increasing inequality and tension within and between countries. And the funding crisis, which is sure to come, will be a massive challenge for museums. But the pandemic really highlights the weakness that existed in museums and the sector before the crisis. Now, as we try to recover, we also have to ensure that we don't end up back at square one. And so we often hear talk of something called build back better, which is a snappy slogan, but it also has a really precise meaning. It comes from disaster risk reduction, which is a management approach, and it means the use of the recovery periods and reconstruction periods after a disaster to increase resilience, restore services, and revitalize livelihoods, economies, and the environment. So with both sustainable development and disaster risk reduction, we're trying to enhance our collective abilities to withstand and absorb shocks and threats, which is our resilience, and to reduce the likelihood of threats occurring in the first place. And these are achieved through effective planning, supporting policies, resourcing, skills, education, information, and partnerships. So we're in a position where many museums need to get back on their feet, but there's also the medium-term need to transform. So today we're going to hear some global perspectives on how museums are addressing sustainable development challenges. And so I have two questions that I'll ask each of our four panelists, and then we'll have a Q&A from the audience. And so for the first question, it is thinking back to the time before the pandemic, what aspects of museums and museum work do you think we should hold on to and enhance, and which aspects should we let go of? And I'd like to ask Karin first.
Thank you, Henry. First of all, and along with greeting each of you, I would like to thank to the British Council, ICOM UK, and the Museums Association for inviting me to this session and to be able to share with you the experiences of the South. The southern Chile, North Patagonia, specifically the river region, where I've lived and worked for more than 20 years, as its name suggests, is characterized by a landscape that combines mountains and ranges, wetlands, rivers, lakes, and sea. It is a territory whose meaning has been built from its inhabitants since more than 9,000 years ago, according to the archaeological data, being able to develop a polyphonic identity from the native people, the Mapuche, to the date. In the diversity of landscapes and historical context of the region, like the reality of many countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region, museums and their narratives respond directly to the needs of their communities, to give value to the history and situated memory of the territories, to strengthening the links and sense of the identity of the original peoples, to configure themselves, especially in the most isolated territories, as spaces of encounter, catharsis, and containment tools for the political use, and spaces that strain areas of justice and rights. Many museums, which we call community or community-based museums, build their narratives and curatorial work not only on the past, but also on how the future is proposed. Environmental democracy, human rights, reasonable use of the natural and cultural resource, and also how to understand heritage from a local and situated perspective. Taking up Henry's question and considering the shared aspects of the reality and the context of the museums in the southern of Chile, as well as many others in the Lake region, it seems to me more and more necessary to promote museums at scales, spaces available to the needs for their community, to take up and strengthen what was proposed at the Round Table of Santiago de Chile, the year 1972, the social function of the museums and the concept of integral museums. I also consider necessary to begin to develop an inclusive approach and active participation of the communities in the development of the contents and curatorial spaces, strengthening a less hierarchical and more dynamic approach, the use of decolonized research methodologies, and consider change and adaptive processes to this as an essential part of the dynamism in a society, and thus also in each of the institutions that represent them, in this case, museums.
Thank you, Karin. And can I ask the same question to Elena, please?
Hello, everyone, and thanks to Henry and everyone for inviting me to speak today as well. So just in reference to your question, Henry, which was around what we feel like we should hold on to as museums, is that right? So I think some of the things that we're thinking about at the David Livingstone Birthplace are making sure, as Karin was saying as well, is making sure that community engagement remains at the heart of everything that we do, making sure that we focus our activities with, for example, with our volunteers around skills development, and I suppose increasing those meaningful opportunities for engagement with volunteers and with community groups. I think some of the things that I'm thinking about when it comes to ensuring inequality issues don't worsen are things around equality and inclusion, making sure that all the great work that's been happening in museums over the last while continues around those areas. And again, touching on what Karin was saying around decolonizing narratives, and in particular around anti-racist practice in museums, and making sure that we offer information and multi-layered information around that as well. Yeah, I think that's it for now from me.
Thanks, Elena. And Susanne, we'll move to Susanne now, please.
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. I'm from Klimahaus, Bremerhaven, 8 degrees east, which is in English it's Klimahaus, and our exhibition is mainly a journey around the world. So it's already kind of a virtual experience, because you can come to our place and go around the world without really having to go around the world. But it's still a place where people have this experience together, and this is something we cannot have in this pandemic at the moment. We are not only looking at climate, but also on people living in different climate zones, and we see this as part of the sustainable development goal, or climate protection as part of the sustainable development goals. And have also an exhibition about sustainability, and yeah, it's something where people can work together. We also have school programs where pupils can develop ideas for the future together, and these programs are not possible at the moment. And I think this is really a problem, that we cannot do this experiences together and these programs. What I think is good, or a good aspect, is that we now can have panels like this with people from all over the world without having to travel a lot. And yeah, this is definitely good for climate protection.
Okay, thanks, Susanne. And lastly, to move to Julie.
Hi, everyone. I'm in Anchorage, Alaska. It's morning here, and the Anchorage Museum is on the land of the Dena'ina, who have stewarded our land past, present, and into the future. I think, like Elena and others talked about, our strongest programs have always been those that really invested in community relationships, that allowed the outcome to be driven by those conversations. I think that's only been enhanced through this last year, that understanding and that belief in that process. It's not always easy for museums not to be outcome driven, and for outcomes to be the beginning of a project. And so I think a lot about the letting go process for us through the pandemic and for museums in general, and that hopefully we've learned a new skill set in agility. One of our major projects around climate and sustainability is called the Seed Lab. We took over a neglected building across the street from the museum, renovated it, began to host conversations about climate and climate justice, and worked with artists and communities on ideas around future solutions. And with the pandemic and not being able to gather, we essentially just turned that space over to individual artists to allow them to do research projects, paint on the walls, take it over, and really become active on social media. And there was a different kind of sharing and a different kind of experience and a different kind of local that I think happened through that experience that just reinforced for us how important it is to just take down in a way everything we've learned and to relearn a way of doing. So just enhanced by the pandemic is letting go of our curatorial statements, letting go of our preconceived ideas, letting go of timelines, letting go of concrete forums, and embracing this new way of connecting to each other. Whatever that looks like, we're just like, it's a new gratitude for any way we can connect to each other. With an exhibition we have currently, it's called Extra Tough. We looked at ideas of gender and women in Arctic places, and we became really rooted in this practice of not applying our own curatorial or our own museum statements to people's artworks, to their stories. So we let artists and community members and cultural bearers be the voice and not impose our own. In a way, it was a new skill set that was developed as we thought about how do we storytell. We have a podcast that we started and a journal that we began that really tries to focus on the idea of sharing knowledge and sharing power and sharing ideas. One of the most popular projects we had was repair workshops before the pandemic began, and we would gather to sew or repair objects and think about consumption. And I think through the pandemic and after, we now see that the idea of repair is incredibly important to communities, and it's not just the repair of things, but our emotional repair and how do we repair communities. So those are some of our thoughts going forward.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much, Julie. And I think just before we move to the second question is just to draw some kind of common threads that come from those four responses, that we see that we're all working in very different situations, but many of the challenges are the same. And one of the really fantastic things with, you know, the potential of webinars and so on, is it's just in a way easier to learn from one another, even as we are in these, you know, extremely difficult and challenging times. And as Julie says there, like any way that we can find to kind of be together and share the challenge really is really very important. And so my second question here is how do each of you think Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals can help guide museums to contribute effectively to a sustainable future? And I suppose that might be either in terms of how you set an agenda or through activity itself, or how you monitor or communicate activity. And so I'll move I'll return to Karin, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in my opinion, Agenda 2030, rather than guiding museums in a proposal for a sustainable future, proposes and makes explicit certain essential functions in which museums must participate. The 5 fundamental dimensions on which the agenda is based, people, prosperity, planet, collective participation, and peace, constitute in themselves the strength of museum spaces, as well as ICOM is collectively seeking today, and specifically from the work being promoted with the new definition of museums. Museums in their diversity and global context are more than buildings or collection and exhibitions. They are themselves institutions that promote the safeguarding and democratic access to natural and cultural, tangible and intangible heritage, as well as it is sustainable use and appropriate management as development and tourism resource. In this way, I believe that the raison d'etre of the museums, unlike many other sectors, is already linked to sustainability and the future projection of humanity. The Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals is an opportunity for us to play with an advantage and contribute from within, not only as a fashion or trend, but with values such as integration, accessibility, inclusion, diversity, and dialogue, among others. In my experience, small-scale museums with success and limitations contribute to the sustainability and development of the community to which they belong. We are able to find synergistic dimensions such as collaboration, reciprocity, and relevance. The projection of this type of museums is based first on the ability to exercise critical reflection, second on the construction of new environmental and cultural relations, and third on the emergence of new social actors whose effective disposition contribute to make sustainability viable in a situated way. That's my answer.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you, Karin. I'll ask Elena the same question, please.
So the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 as well, I think for me and for the David Livingstone Birthplace, like just a little bit of background, our museum is a small independent museum that tells the story of David Livingstone, who was a Victorian adventurer, explorer, figure of empire. And we have been going through a period of redevelopment, and our work has focused on telling and researching those multi-layered stories. So how do the SDGs fit in with that? I think for us, the SDGs have allowed us to look at partnership work, and in particular, working in partnership with education providers. So for example, we have a learning resource that links the Livingstone story specifically with, in Scotland, part of the curriculum is around learning for sustainability. So I suppose for us, in Scotland, we're quite lucky that the SDGs are tightly linked to the curriculum already. And so at the David Livingstone Birthplace, we've developed this learning resource. I think when it comes to post-pandemic issues as well, I think there's a lot that the SDGs can support small independent museums when it comes to advocacy. So really supporting independent museums in figuring out their role within the economy and being able to have those advocacy skills to be able to articulate the role of small independents as well. Yeah, and I think in general, I suppose you don't necessarily need to be an expert on SDGs to develop those partnerships and to really focus on goals that are achievable and yeah, relevant.
Okay, thanks, Elena. Maybe I'll just chip in there that just to say, of course, the point of using the SDGs is not that everyone becomes an expert in 17 goals and 169 targets, or that we use them as something else. It's how we think about how we can implement them into what we do to help us kind of basically do it better. So I'll move to Susanne now, please. Thanks, Elena.
Thank you. Yeah, this is something we also tried. We did look at all the goals, but chose several that we found the most relevant for us at this moment and focused on working with them as an institution. And I think we all can only work on process towards these goals. They're no one is perfect, and we all have to work towards them, but it's still a process. And well, they're designed to be reached in 2030, which is only 9 years away now, but yeah, of course we are still working on them. In Klimahaus, as I said, we also have an exhibition about them, and on our symposium last year, where we talked about how we can come from climate knowledge to climate action, we also developed a declaration, the Bremerhaven Declaration, together with Henry. There we lay out how, for example, how education for sustainable development is something lots of museums work on anyway, because it's empowerment and participation is such a big part of it. And also museums are all over the world are working with those communities. In Klimahaus, for example, we work together with the local Fridays for Future movement and support them. And yeah, museums are about building connections, and this is also part of what the SDGs are for, or what they are based on.
Thanks, Susanne. And finally, Julie.
Thank you. I think there's an enormous role for museums to play in helping people think about the future and in developing future literacy. I'm excited to see more and more conversations about the role museums can play in thinking about where do we want to be, not just where we are and where we have been. Working with many communities, we've seen a struggle for future literacy, that we don't have language or visuals for imagining a future and what we're working towards together. Museums are well placed and well positioned, I think, to apply those conversations with creativity and talk about problem solving and think about aspiration and invention. So I'm really keen to have these conversations about museums' role in the future, not just as preservation of past. In Alaska, we think a lot about upholding and promoting Indigenous knowledge and understanding that that's a key to all futures, not just in our place, but in all places, a better understanding of how we live with nature. The SDGs, I think, are relevant to us as we talk about climate change and climate justice. We are double sure to talk about them in terms of human daily lifeways. So how does climate affect food and transportation and energy? How is it affecting us now? In Alaska, we're bearing witness to change and impact on a daily basis. It's visceral, it's right before us. It's not about anticipating change or impact. So we've been hosting conversations about solutions for clean water and clean energy and sustainable cities and consumption, and what does climate action actually look like? These are tangible to us. It's not 2030 to us here, it's 2021 and counting. I think with the pandemic and so many things, the idea of connecting and reconnecting to the natural world is critical. Working with Indigenous communities for us to better understand place and connections to the environment is critical. I think we need to change from being nasal gazing institutions to ones that are really in service to these big ideas about better places and just societies. Rapid change and a healthier planet. I think the SDGs help us to have that conversation, but they need to be localized, and having those conversations about what are the local versions of those goals, I think are important conversations to all of us. And in a way, I can think of no greater relevance than helping us all move towards a better future. So I think museums' ability to storytell for people in place makes those goals more tangible and more relevant to people.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And I mean, again, just to kind of draw some kind of common threads together, again, we hear about the importance of localizing these agendas, these initiatives, that one of the kind of great challenges that there is often in the museum sector is, or in many sectors, is that they lack a kind of common language or a common goal. And even if we're talking about the SDGs, even in a very informal way, they just help us find kind of fellow travelers a bit more easily. And the goal-based approach, personally, I find is a really fantastic one, because it's like you're trying to do something. We're trying to do something to try to make our own place better, however we define that. And so I've got a couple of questions here that we'll move to. So the first one is, I'll just read it out. How might you respond to the perspective held by some museum professionals that museums are not responsible for the SDGs, but for, hang on, it's moved a bit, but rather for safeguarding, communication and the study of their collections? And I think we can all there's plenty of time to answer this question.
We talk a lot about this at the Anchorage Museum and with our fellow museums, that it is a change of practice and it's necessary. We are maybe lucky enough that our public also demands it of us. And I think eventually it will demand it of all museums, to move away from the idea that we are simply protecting objects, and to understand that those objects are valuable and relevant because of the stories they tell about people in place. And without sharing those with communities and changing the way our practice shares knowledge and shares ideas, and that we provide access to those objects. Without that, I don't think we can be relevant to our communities. I think museums have an imperative to change.
I think I'll add a comment on, is that the idea of looking after things for the future as an end in itself doesn't make sense. That, in using them, because the future isn't some kind of place that already exists. We make the future by what we do today. And so if we change what we do today, that's how we change where we're headed to in the future. That's how I feel about it. Anyone else want to say anything?
Yeah, maybe I think that museums cannot say that they are not responsible for the SDGs, because everybody is responsible for the SDGs. We all have to work towards these goals, and all countries of the world support these goals. And so we are all part of this. So this is, yeah, maybe we don't have a collection, so we are not a classic museum, and when we see ourselves also as a place of communication, but we always think also towards these goals.
Maybe following what Susanne was also saying, I think maybe it's not the responsible as itself, but even if you have collection, you look for the meaning or the relevance of this collection for the community where these museums are located, or even from another place around the world. And if you get back to this, to understand the value of those collections, or the value of why it is relevant to make this safeguarding of collection, we get back to the goals, even although we don't have to, but it gets us always back to the sense of why or how are we supposed to react as museums to the task that our own community is getting now, in this right now moment and in the future. So I think maybe it doesn't, or it was not explicit, but it's something that we have to discuss right now.
And I think that leads very well to another question from someone. They're asking, has the COVID crisis kind of forced a better international dialogue about sustainability issues, mentioning the museum definition and the SDGs?
I'll have a go. I think in some respects, yes, but in others, I suppose there are kind of barriers when it comes to, I mean, international dialogue, yes, but then how do we translate that into action, I suppose, would be my question for myself. Could I add something to the previous question around museum professionals and the SDGs? And maybe it's a bit of a, I'm answering like on a personal level, I suppose. Like, I think the SDGs encompass so much of what museums have been trying to do for a while, that maybe it's a case of unraveling the SDGs and kind of unpicking them, like you were saying, Henry, of like picking one goal to really focus on. But if you're thinking about safeguarding communication, like what are you communicating if not that museum collections have been kind of telling not the same stories, like we're trying to kind of tell different stories as we move on, or the study of the collections as well. I think the SDGs just frame it in a way that makes sense. And yeah, as you've been saying, like a shared language for that. Sorry, I've taken over from this second question, so I'll be quiet now.
It's okay, say what you like. Does anyone else want to reply either to the first one or the second one? Are we done with that one? Okay, so there's another question here, and maybe as an extension of the first one. I'm entirely convinced that museums must incorporate the SDGs, but I'm always at a loss for words when faced with those who don't think museums have this responsibility. And I'm wondering how you would respond to that conservative perspective. I'll go first, and while people gather their thoughts. So, what to do when you're faced with someone that thinks, you know, museums are just in this business, that they just exist and that's kind of okay? That's just like the road to nowhere, I'm afraid. It's like, it just doesn't sound like any kind of value for public money, for public taxes that fund museums. The things that are in museums don't belong to museums, they belong to society. And if society is facing challenges or has, you know, ambitions, then we should be supporting those things. Otherwise, we're just in the way. And I think the other thing to say is that, well, museums are really good at saying that, well, they educate people, or they inform people, and they inspire people. It's often really unclear what they educate them about or what they inspire them to do. You know, museums aren't a kind of end in themselves. They're a means to an end, which is about, a personal view, about helping people and communities, you know, reach their potential, and for a beautiful future where people live in harmony and tolerance. And, you know, as we look around the world, we can see there's a massive need for this. So there's, I mean, this is a quote now, but someone says there is no office for the future. No one looks after the future, really. We have to help society, you know, achieve its potential. I wonder, has anyone else got any thoughts to add to this, to my slightly rambling answer?
That was a lovely rambling answer. I agree. I think the relevance of museums lies really in the ability for us to help people imagine, plan forward, be the office of the future, fill that gap. And really, to serve our communities, we need to, I think, re-examine our value to communities. And I think COVID has forced us to do that, to think again about what our core value is. And most of us have had to really reevaluate that and redefine that. It's been an important time, I think, for museums to take down their egos, take down their walls, literally in a lot of different ways, to be humble and move forward. And I think in that place is exactly what you described, that we can talk about community wellness, help communities reach their potential, convene those conversations about what is possible. I personally, my answer to the people that resist that is there a more exciting, more relevant place to be than to be helping communities move forward? I think probably not.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any more takers for that one. Oh, sorry, Karin.
just to add some small, I just insist on the idea that maybe museums, although the more conservative ones do not join in an explicit way to the SDGs, I think they do it also, neither if they don't want to do it, because they're doing the traditional museological function, and in those are also included some of the main some part of the main goal. So I think rather than thinking or trying to respond to them what they should do, is just let them do what they are doing already, because they're going to increment this because of the community. They're going to ask to do more. So I would be more positive in that, instead of just moving them to what they don't want to, just let them do what they are doing in this traditional way of doing the traditional museological functions. But I think that somehow they are still getting into the goal. So something more.
Thank you.
There are also these very concrete, more traditional ideas of looking at sustainability in museums. We have enormous buildings. We have a climate impact. We're traveling exhibitions and people all of the time. Our climate controls that we require for objects are not sustainable buildings or practices. So there is also that conversation to have about museums, and if economics are the traditional driver of nonprofits and businesses, there's also that conversation and that level of responsibility to our communities, and being these behemoth institutions in most places.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to add to that, so I read recently, like a big museum might have the same carbon footprint as over 1,000 people, and that's crazy. And so, I mean, it does link to this, to that question about what do we say to someone that says, oh, well, this has got nothing to do with us. It's like, whether we like it or not, we all make an impact on the world, you know, for good and for bad. The test really comes in how you want to change your impacts. And that's the principle of sustainable development. There's a question here that visitors play an important role in the sustainability of museums. Where is the visitor in the sustainability of museums? How do we get more from visitors during their visit to a museum? And how can we get visitors to go above and beyond during their visit?
I guess I'll say that I think we also need to have a different conversation besides defining museums in terms of visitorship. That's a pretty traditional metrics about who comes in your door and passively participates in the museum. And I think we need to talk about who our participants, who our partners, who our relationships are with. How are we sharing collection, sharing stories, sharing knowledge, sharing power? That's much different work than a transaction at the front entrance. And so I'd like to see the conversation shift from visitorship to conversations and relationships, and the deep museum work that is often invisible.
Yeah, I'll add a word on that, like, because a few people have spoken about human rights-based approaches, that if we look at the like, there's a thing called there's a right to development, that everyone has a right to expect sustainable development based on active, free and meaningful participation. But if we think about museums, they tend to almost treat people as a kind of homogeneous mass. They produce something that as if people consume it in more or less the same way. It's the wrong way around. It's like, you know, as I think we see very much in how Julie's museum works. It's like thinking from a person-centered approach. Who are the people who come? What are their aspirations? What ideas do they have? What questions do they have? What do they need to move forward from their position in the way that they want? Not in the way that museums or anyone else wants them to be. Because, like mentioning before about the huge carbon footprint of museums, museums can't say, we want you to change your behavior, because that's just not, it's just not a good starting point, I don't think. But does anyone else want to add something to this this last question? Or I'll move
maybe I think that museums can also be a place of dialogue, and not only dialogue between them. So the museum is not there to tell people what to think, but it can also be a place where people talk about things, and it can also work with participative elements and take the views of the visitors to build things, and so it should be a dialogue from my perspective.
Thank you. Thanks, Susanne. I think we have maybe two or three more questions at least. So how might we look at redefining community in a post-COVID scenario?
I think there's exciting ways to rethink communities. We try not to use the word community because we're very pluralistic, and don't assume that there's one community we serve, that we need to be much better at redefining and understanding and listening to many communities, moving away from those traditional ideas of museum service. I think we have always been geographically isolated, so really interested in reaching out internationally because we share so much with other Arctic nations, including in talking about SDGs and climate. Those are really our neighbors that are sharing the similar experiences. And I think COVID has just enhanced that those connections are increasingly valid, that there's a global experience in the pandemic and in COVID, a shared understanding of this need to think about our natural environment. Climate change is going to be a great equalizer in many ways, in terms of a conversation and a shared understanding and thinking about impact. So reaching out, understanding our local environment and our local communities, and the way we serve those local communities, but also how do we have broader conversations beyond our borders, beyond our own understandings, beyond our own locals, to really create a national and international conversation around climate and future.
Yes, I agree with what Julie was saying, and I want just to go back to a poetess, a Chilean poet, who said, I'm going to translate it, but I hope it's understandable, but he said that the error consisted in believing that the earth was ours, when the truth of the matter is that we are of the earth. And I think after COVID, and I think COVID is just an excuse to put more tension in the diversity of the globality. And I think this gets us back to understand community in a bigger way, but also in an even smaller way, to understand that we are part of a world where we have to survive, sharing the resource, not just with the human being, but also with a lot of other kind of living species in the world. So I think more than having a new definition of community is being able to understand this diversity, but also this now, starting from now on, we are going to have in our memories a global experience. COVID is going to be something that is going to be shared by all of the human and not human living in the earth. So I think it's a good question, but I think it's also more than a new definition. It's another way of thinking about community.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Karin. Elena, do you want to say something?
Just a small addition, really. I think from what I've seen over the past year, museums have been able to adapt really quickly and effectively. And I think one of the things that we should be redefining around community is that it's been clear that those, due to the pandemic, hard to reach audiences, we were able to access and kind of engage with those audiences. So hopefully that will continue, and that, I suppose, the concept of the museums just being more relevant and accepting, as we know that often we're the hard to reach institutions, things will change with, I mean, I suppose something that I also think about though is digital access and tech access. So that's something we need to consider moving forward too.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got about five minutes left, something like this. So there's a question here about, does the panel think that museums should stop collecting? And if not, how should they decide what to collect? And there's a second part to the question, what is the role of specialist expertise in museums now?
Well, part of the
I guess
answer.
oh, go ahead,
sorry.
Karin.
No, sorry, Julie, please. Okay.
You.
Okay, sorry. I just was thinking, in my experience and background, I will say to the answer of should museums stop collection, I don't think it's a decision that museums as itself should do. I think it's the community who has to answer if they have or if they need to stop collecting things, or if we need to collect other kind of things, even thinking in some things that make us understand why we do have to do more conservation, not just material, but not just tangible, but also intangible heritage, or even traditional cultural activities. I don't know, if I think maybe more than asking if we have to or we don't have, it's something that we should ask the community if we need to still collect things, or if we do also need to collect other kind of things. I think going more to an answer that has to be shared by the community, not just the decision of the museum's worker or professionals.
I was just going to add that I think for specialists, it's not about whether they have a role in museums or not, or I think it's more about the skill sets that are now necessary for those positions that may not have been necessary a decade or more ago, which is, these are not back of house or behind the scenes positions. These are positions that require relationships with and listening with communities. It's about providing access in new ways. It's about thinking about repatriation of objects. It's about developing and creating new ways of sharing. So I think there's new skill sets required by every sector of museum work that may not have been as imperative just a short time ago.
Thanks, Julia. I think I'll add on to that there is one of the SDG targets is 16.6 is about to provide effective, accountable and transparent institutions. And that's, and to be honest, the way I remember it is because it's EAT. And that's, it actually has a huge amount of material in that, in those three words, effective, accountable and transparent institutions. And if we think about them together, you know, it links very much to, well, should museums collect? Should they have specialists? I think there's no one size fits all. It depends on the museum and its function in its community. And that might be a community of practice, or it might be a community of place. But it's just to give an example of just how much there is richness there is within the goals and targets. There was another question that was, what happens to the objects that need special conditions or treatment? Should they be allowed to disappear? I'll answer it if no.
I think I'll go back to
Okay,
Karen's
brilliant.
comment, but we don't get to decide that. That needs to be in conversation with the true owners and the storytellers and the makers of those objects and the communities that are connected to them. I think that's, museums need to take down their authority and understand that we need to pose questions instead.
Okay, great, thank you. And there was a comment here. Do you think that museums can help towards regenerative development beyond sustainable development? And I think I would just make the point that they're the same thing. That sustainable development isn't about trying to do as little as possible. It is regenerative development. It's about how we help have a kind of thriving future. And I'm just going to pass back to Emily shortly, but does anyone want to make a closing remark or a closing word?
Thank you for hosting us today.
Thank you.
I think absolutely museums have a role in that regenerative, like sustainable development. And I suppose it's about not reinventing the wheel, like working with your communities, as everyone's been saying, and just making sure that you access the research that's gone before you and speaking to people and just making sure that it fits in with what's already planned for your local community by them, by us.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Elena. And so I'll hand back to Emily, and just to say thank you so much for your really fascinating insights, and it's been great to get together to discuss these things together. So thank you, and I'll pass back to Emily.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for that fascinating talk and for your comments and this discussion. Thank you also to ICOM UK and the Museums Association, and also to you, our audience, for your participation and engaging questions. I also want to thank Jill, Claire, and Oriana for their support. It's been a really interesting conversation, and we really encourage you to connect and to continue sharing ideas and actions after this event. You will see that Oriana has put a link to the Google Doc into the meeting chat, where you can leave your details and also who you're interested in connecting with. You will also see a link to a short feedback form in the chat, which would be really grateful if you could fill out. A reminder too that the recording and the transcript will also be available for viewing on our website. Thank you all again for attending. Goodbye.